1 in 3 people will fall in love with someone who emotionally destroys them. That's not just a sad reality, it's a psychological epidemic. You knew they were hurting you. You saw the red flags. You felt the silence after the storms, the empty apologies, the manipulation. But you stayed. And even now, after everything, a part of you still loves them. Why? This isn't weakness. This is wiring. Neuroscience, ancient philosophy, and trauma psychology all say the same thing. We don't just fall in love with people. We fall in love with the story we think will heal us. And when that story breaks, we break with it. But here's what no one told you. That obsession, that heartbreak, that confusion, it's not the end. It's the beginning of power, if you know how to decode it. So if anything I just said hits you, even a little, do something right now to shift the energy. Like this video, share it, comment thank you, or subscribe. It changes everything from here. In 1930, Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And yet, millions today remain trapped in a fate they never chose, loving someone who destroys them from the inside out. According to the American Psychological Association, nearly 1 in 6 people report having been in a relationship with someone exhibiting narcissistic traits. But what they rarely expect is to miss them, to still love them, to ache for the very person who made them feel small. Freud once said the human psyche is split between what we desire and what we fear, and nowhere is this more visible than in toxic love. Neuroscience supports this paradox. When we're in love, especially in unpredictable, unstable relationships, our brain releases dopamine at erratic intervals, the same way it does with addictive drugs. A 2010 study at Rutgers University showed that the brain activity of people in toxic relationships closely mirrors that of drug addicts experiencing withdrawal. You're not weak, you're chemically hooked. But let's go deeper. Why does this attraction start in the first place? It's not just about charm or sex or the highs. Jung believed that we are magnetized by the parts of ourselves we've disowned, the shadow self. The narcissist often reflects exactly that, our buried wounds, our unmet needs, our unhealed stories. Loving them feels like chasing completion. It's not rational because it's archetypal. You're not just responding to a person, you're responding to a pattern. You may think you're in love with them, but you're in love with the illusion of being seen, validated, completed. In childhood, if love was inconsistent, critical, or conditional, your nervous system wired itself to associate unpredictability with affection. According to Dr. Gabor Mate, over 70% of adults with codependent patterns trace them back to early attachment disruptions. You might not consciously remember the wound, but your body does. Your longing isn't weakness, it's a survival strategy once used to stay emotionally safe. Now it's outdated but still operating. Epictetus said, "People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them." And you may not realize this, but you've likely internalized the narcissist's view of you. Their contempt, their coldness, their unpredictability. It burrowed into your self-concept. You didn't just love them, you became addicted to proving your worth through them. That's the trap. But here's what most people don't know. Attraction doesn't mean compatibility. In fact, trauma often disguises itself as attraction. That intense pull? That electric feeling when they reappear? It's often your subconscious trying to rewrite an old story. Studies from Dr. Helen Fisher reveal that the brain lights up most when love feels at risk. Safe love doesn't trigger the same fireworks. That's why the narcissist's hot and cold behavior feels irresistible. It mimics childhood conditions of love withheld and granted based on performance. You might ask yourself, why do I still want them, even after everything? The answer is layered. You want validation from the very person who denied it. It would prove your worth. You crave certainty from someone who thrives on keeping you uncertain. And deeper still, you fear who you might be without the story that you were never enough. Here's the twist. Your brain isn't wired for happiness, it's wired for familiarity. That's why you return. That's why you still feel love. But knowing this is where transformation begins. Because now you're no longer just feeling it, you're seeing it. You're not broken. You're responding to deep, ancient codes inside your psyche. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And part of what you love may not even be the narcissist themselves, but the idea of who they could have been, or who they made you believe they were. That projection can be more addictive than the person. Because in that fantasy, you finally mattered. You were finally loved fully. But that love wasn't real. What was real was the cycle, the confusion, the push and pull that left you doubting your reality. So when you say, "I still love them," understand, love in this context might not mean what you think it does. It may be longing, addiction, a trauma echo, a hunger for resolution, a loop in the psyche begging to be completed. And the first step is no longer shaming yourself for it. Because you're not crazy, you're not weak, you're human, and you're waking up. In 1953, Carl Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The narcissist masters this art, not just in their own life, but in yours. They construct masks so convincing, so intoxicating, that you don't fall in love with the person. You fall in love with the performance. And the tragedy is that your brain, built for pattern recognition and emotional survival, cannot tell the difference. Research from Dr. Ramani Durvasula reveals that narcissists are highly skilled in love bombing, an overwhelming flood of affection, compliments, promises, and attention. It's not real connection, it's psychological bait. And your nervous system, craving attachment, responds with full surrender. According to studies published in Psychology Today, the first stage of a narcissistic relationship activates the same brain circuits as gambling wins. Intermittent reinforcement triggers high dopamine and locks in emotional dependency. But let's go deeper. Why are our minds so easily hijacked by illusions? Freud believed that all humans live with an inner division, the tension between what is real and what we want to be real. The narcissist exploits this inner hunger. They mirror back to you the version of yourself you've always longed to be, desired, admired, understood. It's an emotional hallucination, a carefully crafted fantasy built just for you. And once your mind links this fantasy to safety and love, the game is set. People often underestimate how deep the manipulation goes. Dr. Joe Dispenza explains how repeated emotional experiences actually rewire the brain's neural pathways. Every time you believed the narcissist's lies, every time you forgave, justified, or doubted yourself, those thoughts carved themselves into your biology. So even after the mask falls, your mind still craves the illusion. The ghost of the performance haunts you more than the person ever did. Freud's concept of transference helps explain why you stayed. You weren't just reacting to the narcissist, you were reacting to a symbolic figure. They became your unfinished parent, your unresolved trauma, your echo of abandonment. You hoped that this time, the ending would be different, that this one would love you right, that this illusion would finally become reality. But it never does, because it's not them you want, it's the healing of a wound that predated them. And still, the mask keeps slipping. You catch glimpses, the cruel joke, the cold stare, the moment they mock your vulnerability. But by then, you're already attached to who they were pretending to be. You begin making excuses, telling yourself it was just a bad day, that they're under stress, that you just misunderstood. You gaslight yourself, because the alternative is admitting the person you loved never existed. And that's a grief few people are ready to face. Seneca said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And perhaps that's where your power begins, not in resisting the truth, but in confronting it head-on. The narcissist's mask was never about love, it was about control. Every compliment was a transaction. Every romantic gesture was a setup. The goal was never to connect, it was to conquer. But even now, your mind plays tricks. You remember the laughter, the intimacy, the promises. Your brain replays highlight reels, but not the full movie. That's how illusion works. It edits the story. It leaves out the emotional starvation, the sudden coldness, the slow erosion of your confidence. You weren't losing your mind. You were being slowly conditioned to doubt your reality. Carl Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The narcissist doesn't want transformation. They want dominance without depth, admiration without accountability. They wear the mask because they fear their own emptiness. And when you fell in love with them, you were unknowingly dancing with that emptiness, giving it shape, purpose, and meaning. But the void was never yours to fill. What if the reason you can't stop thinking about them isn't because they were special, but because your mind is still untangling the lie? What if your healing isn't about forgetting the illusion, but finally seeing it for what it was? That's the beginning of power. Not pretending it never happened, but naming exactly what did, clearly, honestly, without shame. Because once the mask falls, so does their hold on you. In 1984, Dr. Judith Herman introduced the term complex trauma to describe what happens when abuse isn't a single event, but a repeated cycle. especially when it comes from someone you trust. This isn't just heartbreak. It's psychological captivity. You don't just miss them, you're bound to them in ways you can't fully explain. Carl Jung called it the possession by the unconscious, where ancient, unhealed parts of us take over without warning. That's what this is. You're not in a love story. You're in a trauma loop. And it's real. Neuroscientists today know what Freud only guessed. Trauma doesn't live in memory, it lives in the body. According to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, emotional abuse leaves the same neurological imprint as physical assault. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, becomes hypersensitive while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking, goes offline. So you're not overreacting. You're reliving. When the narcissist disappears, your brain doesn't feel relief. It feels abandonment. And in response, it craves reconnection, not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar. According to attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby, humans are wired to seek proximity to those who regulate their emotions, even when they're the source of the pain. That's why the more they hurt you, the more you clung to them. Pain became proof of love. The loop tightened. Add to this the power of intermittent reinforcement, a term from behavioral psychology where rewards are given unpredictably. Narcissists master this. They're affectionate, then cold. Available, then distant. Loving, then cruel. And this inconsistency wires your brain like a gambler's at a slot machine. Each tiny moment of warmth becomes disproportionately valuable. You keep pulling the lever, hoping this time, the jackpot will be real. But it never is. And yet, part of you knows. You saw the lies. You felt the coldness. You heard the silence after your pleas. But you stayed. Not because you liked it, but because your nervous system was stuck in survival mode. Trauma distorts time. It convinces you that what's happening now is the only thing that will ever be. That if you leave, you'll be alone forever. That if you stay, maybe you'll fix it. This is the invisible chain, the belief that love requires suffering. But there's more. Freud observed that humans repeat what they cannot remember. It's called repetition compulsion. We return to relationships that mirror our original wounds, hoping to finally master them. If you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable, critical, or volatile, you might unconsciously seek out partners who recreate that landscape. Not because it feels good, but because it feels right. The pain is known, predictable, home, and the narcissist, consciously or not, senses this. They press on the wound you never showed anyone. They exploit your empathy, your hope, your silence. They become both the captor and the cure. They break you, then offer the bandage. They poison you, then offer water, and tell you to be grateful. Seneca once said, "Slavery resides not in the chains but in the mind." And in this kind of relationship, you don't need walls or threats. You only need the belief that your pain is your fault, and that your healing depends on their next gesture. That's how the bondage works. So how do you break the loop? You begin by seeing the cycle, naming it, not blaming yourself for staying, but understanding why you stayed. Dr. Nicole Lepra, the holistic psychologist, reminds us that awareness is the beginning of change. The moment you recognize the pattern, you loosen its grip. The moment you stop idealizing the pain, you reclaim choice. Because here's what no one told you. You weren't weak for loving them. You were human. You wanted connection. And they used it against you. But the same depth that made you vulnerable, your ability to feel deeply, to hope, to believe in change, is also your way out. The loop only holds if you remain unconscious. And now, you're waking up. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But what happens when the person you must let go of is the one who made you feel like you had a soul? That's the unbearable paradox of healing from a narcissistic relationship. You begin to untangle, and suddenly you feel disloyal. Not to them, but to a version of yourself that once needed them to survive. According to Dr. Janina Fisher, trauma expert and author of Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma, people often resist healing not because they enjoy suffering, but because their identity is entangled with the pain. You didn't just love the narcissist. You became someone in relation to them, the fixer, the empath, the redeemer. Letting them go feels like killing that version of yourself. And it is, but only so something else can be born. The reason healing hurts is because trauma bonds masquerade as love. You're not just grieving a person. You're grieving an identity, a fantasy, a lifetime of emotional patterns that once gave you a sense of control. Dr. Peter Levine, founder of Somatic Experiencing, explains that unresolved trauma locks the body in cycles of activation and collapse. And so, when you finally try to leave, your body resists. Your mind calls it betrayal, but it's actually release. Here's what most people never understand about narcissistic relationships. They teach you that love is earned through endurance, that your worth depends on how much you can tolerate. So when you start setting boundaries, your nervous system doesn't register it as empowerment, it registers it as danger. A rupture in the old map. That's why you feel guilty. That's why walking away feels like abandonment, even when you're the one who was abandoned all along. Freud believed that guilt is the guardian of internal conflict. It keeps us from becoming someone new, even when the old self is suffocating. You might find yourself thinking, maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood them. Maybe it was my fault. That's not clarity, it's conditioning. That's the echo of being gaslit, repeatedly, until doubt becomes your default state. Your betrayal isn't real. It's learned. According to trauma therapist Shannon Thomas, survivors of narcissistic abuse often face cognitive dissonance, holding two truths that cannot exist together. They hurt me, but I love them. They lied, but I miss them. They destroyed me, but I still want them back. And the brain, unable to resolve this conflict, picks the familiar over the true. Because truth demands change. Familiarity just demands endurance. Even ancient wisdom speaks to this war within. Epictetus wrote, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." But you've been conditioned to believe that love is control. That if you were perfect enough, calm enough, giving enough, you could have saved it. That illusion is the final chain. And healing cuts it. But here's the part no one tells you. When you begin to heal, your pain won't vanish overnight. It will scream louder. Not because you're failing, but because you're finally listening. The pain isn't punishment. It's information. It's the part of you that was silenced, now roaring back to life. You may feel numb. You may feel like you're losing something precious. But what you're actually losing is a lie, a mask, a manipulation, a myth you were forced to live inside. And behind that collapse is something sacred, the real you, the self you forgot, the one that existed before the war. Dr. Richard Schwartz, creator of internal family systems therapy, teaches that inside every one of us are subpersonalities formed from past wounds. The part that still loves them, that's a protector. It believes love keeps you safe. It isn't your enemy, but it no longer gets to drive. Healing isn't betrayal. It's remembrance. It's returning to who you were before you were told you had to earn love through pain. It's forgiving yourself for every time you abandoned your own voice just to be heard by someone who never listened. You are not betraying them by moving on. You are liberating yourself from a version of reality where you were never free. And that liberation begins, not when you stop missing them, but when you stop needing to justify why you stayed. Because you don't owe anyone a perfect story. You owe yourself the truth. In 1959, Carl Jung wrote that freedom stretches only as far as the limits of our consciousness. And for most people trapped in toxic love, those limits feel like walls. Invisible, heavy, familiar. But here's the turning point. There is a part of you that never fully believed the lie. A part that watched it all unfold, silently. That part is your inner observer. And awakening it changes everything. The inner observer is the quiet presence behind your emotions. Not numb, not distant, but aware. It's the part of you that watches the chaos without becoming it. In neuroscience, this is called metacognition, the brain's ability to reflect on its own thought patterns. And it's powerful. Studies from the University of Toronto show that people who cultivate metacognition are more resilient to emotional manipulation and can disrupt trauma cycles faster than those who don't. It's not self-help hype, it's brain training. When you begin to observe your thoughts instead of drowning in them, the spell begins to break. You no longer are the one who misses them. You notice the part that misses them. You don't collapse into guilt, you recognize guilt arising. This may seem subtle, but it's the key to freedom. Because until now, your nervous system and your identity have been fused. Every trigger felt like truth. Every emotion became evidence. But they're not. They're echoes, not facts. Freud saw this separation of self as essential to healing. He called it the ego observing the ID. The moment you can witness your compulsions instead of obeying them, you regain authorship. But this takes practice, and honesty, and most of all, stillness. Because narcissistic relationships are loud. They keep you reactive, always off balance, always explaining, defending, hoping. But healing begins when you stop answering. Not to them, but to your own fear. You may feel resistance. You may feel disloyal to your old self. But the observer doesn't judge. It simply sees. Jung believed this witnessing was the beginning of individuation, the return to your true essence. Not the survival self, not the performer, but the core, the quiet center that was never broken, only buried. Dr. Tara Brach, a clinical psychologist and meditation teacher, calls this shift the sacred pause. When you pause, even for a second, and say, "This feeling is here, but it is not who I am," you reclaim your agency. It might sound spiritual, but it's profoundly biological. That one moment of observation activates the prefrontal cortex, reducing amygdala reactivity and grounding you back into conscious choice. It's science and soul working together. This is why meditation helps. Not because it fixes you, but because it reveals what's always been there, a deeper self beneath the noise. A 2020 study from Harvard found that just 10 minutes of mindfulness a day over 8 weeks can measurably shrink the amygdala, the fear center, and thicken the gray matter in areas tied to emotional regulation. You're not meditating to feel calm. You're meditating to remember who's behind the storm. Marcus Aurelius practiced this. In Meditations, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's not just philosophy, that's liberation in motion. When the narcissist no longer controls your attention, they lose their grip, and you begin to see clearly, not only them, but yourself. You might ask, if I awaken the observer, does the pain go away? Not at first, but it changes shape. Instead of defining you, it becomes a teacher, a signal, a doorway. The pain doesn't shrink, you expand around it. And in that expansion, new choices appear. Not just survival choices, but soul choices. The kind you forgot were possible. And here's what's most important. The observer is not cold. It doesn't detach from life. It deepens your engagement with it. Because when you stop clinging to illusions, you start living from reality. Not the fantasy they offered, but the truth you build. The inner observer doesn't erase your past. It reclaims it. It says, yes, that happened. And yes, I survived. And now, I choose differently. That moment, quiet, uncelebrated, invisible to the world, is where real freedom begins. And once you feel it, even once, you can't go back. In his final years, Freud admitted that out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. It sounds poetic, until you're in the aftermath, surrounded by silence, shame, and the echo of a love that dismantled you. You're not just trying to move on. You're trying to understand. You replay conversations in your mind like forensic tapes. You obsess. You analyze. You wonder what was real. And that obsession, strange as it feels, is not madness. It's your mind trying to extract meaning from chaos. Carl Jung believed that all neurosis is the result of a soul that hasn't found its path to transformation. In other words, if your pain doesn't become insight, it becomes a loop. Obsession is your psyche demanding resolution. But there's a pivot point, and it's this. Once you stop trying to change them and start trying to understand you, everything shifts. The same energy that once pulled you into their orbit can be turned inward, like fire finally harnessed. Let's talk about the brain. According to neuroscientist Dr. Candace Pert, emotional pain lives in your body's neuropeptides, chemical messengers stored in muscle, tissue, and nerves. That's why even after months, a scent or a song can flood you. The past isn't gone, it's stored. But here's the key. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Meaning the more you dwell on loss, the stronger that pain loop becomes. But if you redirect those thoughts with purpose, with new meaning, you forge entirely new circuits. This isn't theory. It's neuroplasticity, the science of becoming someone new. Epictetus taught that every difficulty in life presents us with an opportunity to turn inward and to invoke our inner resources. He wasn't romanticizing suffering. He was explaining transformation. What if your obsession isn't the problem, but the portal? What if it's not about forgetting, but about decoding? Because beneath your pain are answers you couldn't access before. You see the cracks in the illusion. You remember your own red flags. You recognize patterns that weren't love, they were survival scripts. You learn that the narcissist was never your mirror, they were your contrast. They showed you what you will never accept again. And that, right there, is power. Dr. Edith Eger, Holocaust survivor and psychologist, writes in The Gift that you can't heal what you don't feel. So yes, feel the rage, the loss, the longing, but then go deeper. What did this experience reveal about the way you love? about what you tolerate, about who you become when you're afraid of abandonment. That's where insight is born. And insight is the seed of freedom. Because healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means reclaiming authorship over how it shaped you. You get to tell the story now. Not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a witness who woke up. So how do you turn pain into power? Not by pretending you're fine, but by recognizing that you already survived what was meant to destroy you. You're not broken, you're breaking open. And inside that opening is the voice you silenced. The dreams you postponed. The dignity you traded for crumbs. Now it's all rising. Use the obsession. Let it point you inward. Take everything you gave to them, the patience, the forgiveness, the fierce devotion, and offer it to yourself fully. Not as a gesture, but as a lifestyle. You don't need closure from them. You need a new agreement with yourself. You can still love them. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. But now, you also love yourself more. Enough to walk away. Enough to rebuild. Enough to outgrow the version of you that once believed this was love. As Seneca said, it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult. Dare now. To stand. To heal. To rise. Not in spite of what happened, but because of it. Because the story of obsession is not how it ends. The story of insight is how you begin again.